The alarm rang at 5:30 a.m., as it did every morning, and Ruth's hand instinctively silenced it before her eyes even opened. She lay there for a moment, listening to the hum of the early morning city, the faint sounds of traffic beginning to pick up as dawn broke over the skyline. This was the time she often allowed herself to dream, to picture the life she'd been working toward for years, where she'd finally earned the respect, recognition, and position she knew she deserved. For 5 years, she'd been a diligent employee, coming in early, staying late, picking up every extra assignment tossed her way without a hint of complaint. She was a secretary, but one with ambitions of climbing higher, of shedding the title that left her feeling invisible among her colleagues. Her job had always been a stepping stone, not a destination. Yet lately it seemed that stone had begun to weigh her down. Each day looked the same, organizing files, answering calls, taking notes in meetings, and handling all the administrative details that no one else seemed to want. She was good at it, though. Ruth's attention to detail and knack for problem-solving made her invaluable, even if she rarely heard that from anyone in the office. She liked to imagine it was all noticed, stored away somewhere, and that when the right opportunity opened up, someone would remember how much she contributed. But so far, each time a new position had opened, she'd watched her coworkers get promoted instead. People who hadn't been there as long, who didn't work half as hard. They would suddenly be granted a higher title, a raise, and the admiration she quietly craved. Ruth tried to be patient, to believe that her time would come if she kept proving herself. But the weight was starting to wear on her, and her patience was stretched thin. As she stepped into the office building, she felt the familiar rush of brisk air conditioning and the soft hum of voices blending with the clinking of coffee mugs and phones ringing. She was greeted by the same faces she saw every day, her colleagues exchanging the usual nods and quick glances as they went about their morning routines. Yet one person always stood out, Mr. Gass, the branch manager and her direct supervisor. He was a man of imposing presence, his tall frame and crisp suits lending him an air of authority that commanded the room. Even a simple nod from him could make a person feel seen and validated. Mr. Gass was well into his 40s, but there was a timeless charm about him that made everyone stop and take notice. He had sharp features, silvering hair that only seemed to enhance his allure, and a gaze that felt like it could peer straight into a person's intentions. For Ruth, there was an undeniable pull in his presence, even though it was mixed with an underlying intimidation. She knew she shouldn't feel this way. He was her boss, after all, and well out of her age range, but she couldn't help it. He had a charisma she'd never encountered before, and there were moments when she caught herself wondering if he noticed her as anything more than just another member of his staff. Lately there had been subtle signs that perhaps he did. Small things like the way he'd linger a bit too long when he passed her desk, or how he'd make eye contact just a second longer than usual. She often brushed these thoughts away, chalking them up to her imagination, a product of her growing frustration with her current role. But deep down, she knew there was something in the way he looked at her, a hint of admiration, perhaps, or interest that went beyond her job performance. One Friday afternoon, as Ruth was sorting through a stack of files, she overheard a conversation between two coworkers. They were discussing a new opening in the company, a position she'd had her eye on for months. Her heart leapt as she listened to them talk about the role and the responsibilities it entailed. It was a step up from her current position, one that would finally allow her to take on more significant tasks and move beyond the secretary's desk. This is it, she thought, excitement fluttering in her chest. All the extra hours, the weekends spent at her desk, the overlooked contributions, they had to mean something now. She'd been here longer than anyone else in her department, and she knew the inner workings of the office better than most. She was qualified, capable, and more than ready to handle the demands of the role. When she saw Mr. Gass passing by, she stood up, clearing her throat. "Mr. Gass, I just wanted to let you know that I'm really interested in the open position." He paused, looking at her with that unreadable expression she'd grown accustomed to. "Are you Ruth?" he asked, his voice smooth, yet hinting at something more. He gave a slight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You've certainly worked hard here. Let's talk more about this later." The way he said it made her heart skip. The tone was ambiguous, yet she felt encouraged, or maybe even hopeful. She just had to prove to him, somehow, that she was the right choice. Her chance had finally come, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The following Monday, Ruth arrived at work feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent the weekend meticulously preparing her case for why she deserved the promotion. In her mind, she rehearsed her arguments, listing her accomplishments, the countless overtime hours, and the dedication she'd shown. She was ready for whatever Mr. Gass might throw her way, or so she thought. As she sat at her desk that morning, she noticed Mr. Gass walking toward her. He stopped right by her desk, leaning over slightly, his cologne filling the space between them with a warm, musky scent. "Good morning, Ruth," he said, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "I was hoping we could talk about that promotion. Do you have time after hours today?" Her stomach flipped at his words. She tried to keep her tone steady. "Of course, Mr. Gass. I'd be happy to discuss it." "Good," he replied, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "I appreciate employees who are willing to go the extra mile." She couldn't shake the strange feeling his words left in her. He looked at her for a beat longer than was necessary, his eyes lingering before he finally straightened and continued down the hall. She exhaled, her cheeks warm with an inexplicable flush. It was hard to tell if she was flattered, nervous, or something else entirely. The rest of the day passed slowly, each hour dragging by as she imagined the upcoming conversation with Mr. Gass. By the time the office began to clear out, her nerves were on edge. At precisely 6 p.m., she knocked lightly on his office door and heard his voice inviting her in. The room was dimly lit, a faint golden hue from the setting sun casting long shadows across the office. Mr. Gass was standing by the window, gazing out at the city below, his posture relaxed, yet his expression unreadable. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please sit," he said, his tone casual yet controlled. She took a seat, folding her hands in her lap to steady herself as he settled into the chair across from her. There was a tension in the air, a charged silence that she couldn't quite put her finger on. She waited, half expecting him to dive straight into a conversation about the position. Instead, he leaned back, folding his hands thoughtfully. "You've been with us for quite some time, Ruth. 5 years, isn't it?" "Yes, that's right," she replied, feeling prickling of nervous anticipation. He nodded, his gaze steady and appraising. "I have to say, it's rare to find someone with your dedication these days. Most people don't stick around long enough to prove themselves the way you have." "Thank you, Mr. Gass. I really love working here," she said, feeling encouraged. This was the moment she had prepared for, the chance to talk about her dedication and commitment. "I've noticed," he replied, his voice softening in a way that felt more intimate than professional. "In fact, I'd say you're one of the most reliable people here." His eyes met hers, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her heart quicken. It's rare to find loyalty like that. There was something in the way he spoke, a lingering emphasis on the word loyalty that made her stomach flutter. She couldn't quite place it, but there was an implication in his tone that felt both promising and unsettling. Ruth cleared her throat, trying to bring the conversation back to safer territory. "Thank you, Mr. Gass. I've always tried to go above and beyond for this company. That's why I feel I'd be a great fit for the open position." He smiled, a slow, almost knowing smile that made her pulse race. "I can see you're ambitious, Ruth. Ambition is a quality I admire." His gaze dropped for a moment, seeming to scan her in a way that was uncomfortably close to personal. "And I believe there's room for someone with your capabilities." She shifted slightly in her chair, forcing herself to hold his gaze despite the uneasy feeling building in her chest. "I appreciate that, Mr. Gass," she replied carefully, not sure how to respond to the compliment. "I've worked very hard for this, and I'd be grateful for any advice you have on how to move forward." He seemed to consider her words, tilting his head thoughtfully. "Advice, yes. I suppose I could give you some pointers. But sometimes, Ruth, it's not just about hard work or even qualifications." He paused, leaning forward, slightly dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. Sometimes it's about relationships, connections. She nodded, her mind whirling. Of course I understand that, she said, her voice wavering slightly. Good, he replied, his smile widening. You've made quite an impression on me, Ruth, and I believe that if you continue supporting me the way you have, we could both benefit. The words hung in the air, thick with ambiguity. She felt a knot forming in her stomach, unsure if she was interpreting his message correctly or reading too much into his words. He was her boss, after all. Yet the way he looked at her now, the way he leaned forward, his hand resting so close to hers on the desk, felt unmistakably intimate. Thank you, Mr. Gass, she said finally, trying to mask her discomfort. I'm very committed to supporting you and the company. He straightened, giving a satisfied nod. I'm glad to hear it. I'll be keeping an eye on you, Ruth. I trust you won't disappoint me. As she left his office, her heart was pounding. She replayed his words in her mind, her cheeks flushed, her thoughts muddled. There was no clear indication of what exactly he was asking for, but she sensed that his expectations might go beyond the professional. And yet, for a moment she wondered if this ambiguous connection between them could be the key to finally securing the promotion she deserved. That evening, Ruth lay in bed, her mind churning over the conversation with Mr. Gass. She felt a thrill at his praise, his acknowledgement of her loyalty and ambition, but there was also an undercurrent of discomfort she couldn't ignore. She had wanted this promotion so badly for so long, but at what cost? The words he'd chosen, words like loyalty, support, and connection, played over in her mind. They felt like hints, as if he were testing her boundaries, seeing how far she'd be willing to go. She knew he had the power to grant her the promotion, but she also sensed that she might be stepping into something she hadn't fully anticipated. As the city lights glowed faintly through her window, she wrestled with her decision. She'd come too far to turn back now. She'd spent 5 years proving her worth, and she couldn't let this chance slip away. Yet, a part of her wondered if she could live with herself if she compromised her integrity for a position. In the quiet of her bedroom, Ruth realized that her dreams of career success might come with strings attached, and she would soon have to decide just how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. The next morning, Ruth went about her work as usual, though her mind was far from the files she organized and the calls she answered. Every time she saw Mr. Gass's office door open, her pulse quickened. His words from the night before echoed in her mind, replaying with every look he cast in her direction, every time he stopped by her desk for no apparent reason. By midday, she received an email from him with a subject line that made her heart race. Dinner tonight? Just us. I'd like to discuss the promotion further. Ruth stared at the screen, her finger hovering over her mouse as she debated how to respond. It was unusual for him to ask her out like this, but she reasoned that it could be a chance to impress him further, to show her dedication. But still there was something that felt strange, something that made her question his intentions. She typed a response, carefully phrasing her acceptance in a neutral way, hoping it would keep things professional. As the workday wound down, her nerves flared. She thought about calling off, making an excuse to avoid the dinner, but the thought of jeopardizing her chance at the promotion stopped her. She left her desk precisely at 5, taking a deep breath to steady herself as she made her way out of the building and toward the restaurant where Mr. Gass had arranged to meet her. Ruth arrived at the upscale restaurant a few minutes early, the dim lighting and quiet atmosphere making her feel slightly uneasy. She spotted Mr. Gass at a secluded corner table, already seated with a drink in hand. He looked up, his eyes lighting up as he saw her enter, and waved her over. "You're right on time," he said, his voice carrying a warm yet slightly teasing tone. "I appreciate that in an employee and in a dinner companion." She forced a smile, taking a seat across from him. As she settled into her chair, she noticed his gaze linger on her, tracing over the simple black dress she'd chosen for the evening. She tried to brush off the intensity of his stare, reminding herself that this was a professional dinner, even if it felt far more personal. The conversation started lightly, Mr. Gass asking about her background, her goals, and what she liked most about her role. He ordered a bottle of wine, filling both their glasses without asking, and she felt a flush creep up her cheeks as she sipped, trying to relax. "So, Ruth," he said, his voice lowering slightly as he leaned forward, "tell me why this promotion means so much to you. I mean, you're already indispensable in your current role. It's clear the team couldn't function half as well without you." Ruth felt the weight of his words, flattered yet slightly off balance. She knew she'd been a crucial part of the office, but this was the first time he had openly acknowledged it. I want to keep growing. I've put in a lot of effort here, and I believe I could take on more responsibility," she replied, choosing her words carefully. He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "And that's what I admire about you, Ruth. You're committed, ambitious, and frankly hard to ignore." Her stomach fluttered at the intensity in his eyes, the way his words seemed to carry layers of meaning. She took another sip of wine, searching for something to say to diffuse the tension she felt building between them. "Thank you, Mr. Gass. That means a lot." "Please," he said, giving her a disarming smile. "Call me Stephen. After all, we're not in the office now, are we?" She hesitated, caught off guard by his casual use of his first name. It felt like a subtle shift, another line being blurred between them. "All right, Stephen," she said, testing the name on her lips. It felt strange, intimate even, and she noticed the way his expression softened when she said it. The conversation flowed from there, moving from work to personal topics with surprising ease. He spoke of his early career struggles, the long hours he had put in to climb the ranks, and how he appreciated seeing a similar drive in her. Yet, as the evening progressed, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that their conversation was veering off course. Stephen's words grew more flattering, his compliments more personal, and she began to feel herself drawn into the subtle charm he exuded. As dessert was served, Stephen leaned back in his chair, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "You know, Ruth, people like you are hard to find. Someone willing to go beyond expectations, to give everything for their career," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "That kind of loyalty doesn't go unnoticed." She nodded, unsure of what to say, and sensing that there was more to his words. "I appreciate that, Stephen. I've always tried to give my best." "And you have," he replied, leaning forward slightly. "But tell me, just how far would you go to get this promotion?" The question caught her off guard, the bluntness of it making her breath hitch. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a knowing look flashing in his eyes. "Relax, Ruth. I'm simply asking if you're willing to be flexible. Sometimes getting ahead in a company like ours requires a little give and take." His words hung in the air, each syllable heavy with implication. She shifted in her seat, her cheeks warming as she struggled to decipher his intent. There was a boldness in his tone, a daring that left her feeling both intrigued and apprehensive. I'm dedicated to this company, and I want to prove that I'm the right choice for the position," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, his gaze piercing. "Good. That's what I like to hear. I see great potential in you, Ruth, and I'd hate to see that potential wasted." His words seemed to carry an unspoken promise, one that left her feeling both excited and uneasy. They finished their dessert in silence, the weight of his words lingering as they each processed the evening's events. When the bill arrived, he placed his hand lightly over hers, his touch warm and lingering. "I hope tonight's conversation has given you some insight," he said, his voice smooth and coaxing. "I'll be in touch soon about the position." As she walked out of the restaurant, Ruth felt a storm of emotions swirling within her. There was excitement, yes, the thrill of being noticed, of feeling close to finally achieving her goal. But beneath it, there was also a sense of apprehension, a nagging doubt about what exactly Stephen expected of her. She wanted the promotion more than anything, yet she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was stepping into dangerous territory. Back in her apartment that night, Ruth found herself replaying every word, every lingering glance, every subtle touch. She wanted to believe that Stephen's interest in her was purely professional, that he valued her dedication and recognized her hard work. But the ambiguity of his words, the way he had tested her willingness to go far for the promotion, left her questioning everything. As she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, she whispered to herself, What am I willing to do for this promotion? She knew she couldn't ignore the signals he was sending, yet a part of her felt exhilarated by the risk, by the power she might wield in his favor. But was this the path she truly wanted to take? Or was she about to make a choice she would regret? The line between ambition and compromise had never felt so thin, and with each passing day she felt herself slipping further toward the point of no return. A few days after their dinner, Ruth was seated at her desk, trying to focus on her tasks. But her thoughts kept drifting back to that evening with Stephen. His words had lingered in her mind, creating an uneasy anticipation that left her both excited and on edge. She hadn't heard anything about the promotion yet, but she told herself to be patient. Perhaps this was all part of the process, him testing her dedication. Around mid-morning, her email pinged with a message from him. It was short and direct. Meet me in my office at noon. I have a special project I'd like you to handle. Her heart raced. A special project, was this part of her evaluation for the promotion? She spent the rest of the morning preparing herself, mentally rehearsing everything she could say to show her dedication and skill. At precisely noon, she knocked on Stephen's door, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves in her chest. "Come in," his voice called, smooth and commanding. She entered, noting that he had dimmed the lights and drawn the blinds, casting the room in a low, intimate glow. He was seated behind his desk, watching her with a look that was both welcoming and intense. "Please have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap as she waited for him to speak. "Ruth," he began, his tone calm but carrying a hint of something she couldn't quite place, "you've shown exceptional commitment to this company. I think it's time we started working more closely together." He slid a file across the desk toward her, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment as she reached for it. "This is a confidential assignment, something I'm trusting only you to handle." Ruth opened the file, scanning the documents within. It was a high-profile client account, one of the company's most lucrative, with detailed notes on upcoming meetings and strategies. This was well beyond her usual administrative tasks. Her pulse quickened at the realization. This wasn't just an assignment, it was an opportunity. "This is significant," she said, looking up at him, her eyes wide. He smiled, clearly pleased with her reaction. "Yes, and I trust you'll give it the same dedication you give to everything else." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "And remember, Ruth, discretion is key. This project requires a certain level of confidentiality." She nodded, feeling a thrill at the trust he was placing in her. But as she took the file and stood to leave, he reached out, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "One more thing," he said, his eyes holding hers with that same intense gaze. "I'd like you to join me for dinner again this Friday. Think of it as a working dinner to discuss the project." Her heart skipped a beat, the request feeling like both a privilege and a challenge. "Of course, Stephen," she replied, her voice steady even as her thoughts swirled with anticipation. Friday evening arrived and Ruth found herself once again seated across from Stephen in a dimly lit restaurant. She wore a dress a bit bolder than her usual work attire, something that made her feel both confident and slightly exposed. The atmosphere felt different this time. There was a familiarity between them now, an unspoken understanding that added a layer of tension to every glance and every word. They started with small talk, discussing the project and its challenges, but gradually, the conversation shifted into more personal territory. "You know, Ruth," Stephen said, swirling the wine in his glass, "it's rare to find someone with your level of loyalty and commitment. You have a fire and ambition. I find it inspiring." His gaze held hers, his words filled with admiration, but tinged with something deeper. She smiled, her cheeks warming under his praise. "Thank you, Stephen. I've always believed in working hard and showing dedication." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an almost whisper. "Dedication is exactly what I value, Ruth, and I'd like to see how far that dedication can go." His hand reached across the table, his fingers brushing over hers in a way that was unmistakably personal. She froze, her heart pounding as she felt the warmth of his touch. The line between professional and personal had officially been crossed, and she knew that in that moment, she was facing a choice. Ruth pulled her hand back slowly, glancing down, her mind racing. "Stephen, I didn't expect this." He smiled, unfazed, as if he had anticipated her reaction. "Relax, Ruth. I'm just saying I see potential in you. Potential for more than just a promotion." There it was, laid out in the open, the unspoken promise behind his words. He was offering her more than just a career opportunity. He was offering her something she had never anticipated. But there was a price, one she hadn't fully considered until now. Later that night, Ruth lay awake, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced. Stephen's words, his touch, the intensity of his gaze, it all replayed in her mind, each memory laced with an allure she couldn't deny. But there was also an underlying dread, a fear of what this could mean for her future. She had wanted this promotion so desperately, but was she willing to step into something that could forever change her life? She had worked too hard to let this opportunity slip away, yet the cost of pursuing it weighed heavily on her. Was this truly the path to her dreams? Or was she stepping into a trap, one that would leave her questioning her worth and integrity? A part of her felt exhilarated by the power she held in this moment, the knowledge that Stephen saw her as more than just another employee. But another part of her wondered if she could ever feel satisfied, knowing she had compromised herself in the pursuit of success. As the hours ticked by, Ruth knew she was at a crossroads. She could take the promotion, accept Stephen's offer, and step into a world where ambition and intimacy collided, or she could walk away, leaving behind the promises of success and advancement, but keeping her integrity intact. In the darkness of her room, Ruth whispered to herself, "How far am I willing to go?" A week after that second dinner, Ruth received the news she'd been waiting for. The promotion was hers. Stephen delivered the announcement in person, his hand lingering on her shoulder as he congratulated her. She felt a surge of pride and relief, but beneath it, a quiet unease simmered. She couldn't shake the feeling that this achievement, something she'd dreamed about for years, now came with a cost she hadn't fully anticipated. In her new role, she found herself working closely with Stephen, often staying late and handling high-profile projects that brought them into frequent, private meetings. At first, she reveled in the responsibility, feeling valued and respected in ways she had craved. But over time, she noticed subtle shifts in Stephen's behavior. His touches grew bolder, his glances lingered longer, and the tone of their conversations often veered into personal territory. Each encounter left her feeling conflicted, caught between the thrill of being noticed and a growing sense of discomfort. One evening, after a particularly long day, Stephen invited her into his office, closing the door behind them. "You've been exceptional, Ruth." "Truly," he said, his voice low and warm. "I hope you know how much I appreciate everything you've done." "Thank you, Stephen," she replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "You're more than just an employee to me, Ruth. I hope you understand that." Her heart pounded, the weight of his words settling over her. She knew what he was implying, what he expected, and yet she felt trapped, unsure of how to respond. She nodded, forcing a smile, feeling the walls close in around her. As Ruth's position within the company solidified, she began to notice subtle changes in her colleagues' behavior. People who had once been friendly and supportive now treated her with a newfound distance, their smiles laced with suspicion or outright disdain. She heard whispers as she passed, fragments of conversations that left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. One afternoon, a co-worker she had once been close with pulled her aside. "Ruth," she began, her voice hushed. "I don't know what's going on between you and Stephen, but people are talking." Ruth felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. "There's nothing going on," she insisted, though the words felt hollow, even to her own ears. The coworker gave her a sympathetic look. I thought you should know. Be careful, Ruth. Once these rumors start, they're hard to shake." Ruth nodded, the weight of her choices settling heavily on her. She had wanted this promotion so badly, but now it felt tainted, as though the very achievement she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. The respect she had craved seemed further away than ever, replaced by suspicion and isolation. The weeks passed, and Stephen's demands on Ruth became more personal, his expectations blurring the lines of professionalism more blatantly with each encounter. He would call her into his office late at night, his conversations shifting from work-related matters to personal topics that left her feeling uncomfortable and exposed. One evening, he invited her out for another working dinner, but this time, she felt a deeper sense of dread rather than excitement. She could sense his intentions growing bolder, his compliments tinged with possessiveness that made her skin crawl. As they sat across from each other at the dimly lit table, Stephen leaned in, his gaze intense. "You know, Ruth, loyalty is something I value deeply. I hope you're as committed to me as I am to you." She forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course, Stephen. I appreciate everything you've done for me." He reached across the table, his hand resting on hers in a way that felt unmistakably possessive. "Good, because I'd hate to think that you weren't as invested in this relationship as I am." Ruth's heart raced, her mind scrambling to find a way out of this trap she'd walked into. She had wanted the promotion, yes, but now it felt as though she'd signed away her freedom, her sense of self, for a position that came with invisible chains. That night, as Ruth walked home alone, she felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had achieved what she had always dreamed of, yet the reality felt hollow, even repulsive. She had once been proud of her ambition, her willingness to work hard and prove herself, but now she saw the cost of that ambition in stark clarity. In her mind, she replayed the moments with Stephen, each lingering touch, each failed demand, and she felt a surge of anger, not just at him, but at herself. She had compromised her integrity, her values, all in the name of success. But now, with her position secure yet her reputation and self-respect shattered, she was forced to confront the truth. She could no longer continue down this path without losing herself entirely. As she walked through the quiet streets, Ruth made a decision. She would confront Stephen, set boundaries, and reclaim the control she had given away. She didn't know if it would cost her the promotion, her job, or even her reputation, but she knew that she couldn't keep sacrificing her sense of self for a career that felt increasingly hollow. The next day she would face Stephen, ready to draw a line she should have set long ago, determined to take back the power she had let slip through her fingers. The next morning, Ruth arrived at work with a renewed sense of determination. She had spent the night preparing herself, running through what she would say, envisioning how she would finally set boundaries with Stephen. She knew there was a high chance this conversation could jeopardize everything, her promotion, her job, and perhaps even her reputation, but she also knew she couldn't keep going down this path. As soon as she saw Stephen arrive, she took a deep breath and made her way to his office, knocking firmly on the door. "Come in," he called, his voice as smooth and composed as ever. She entered, closing the door behind her, and faced him directly. Stephen looked up, a hint of surprise flickering across his face. "Ruth, what a pleasant surprise. Is there something I can help you with?" She took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "Actually, yes. I wanted to talk to you about boundaries." His eyebrows raised slightly, though he kept his expression neutral. "Boundaries." "Yes," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Stephen, but I feel that things have crossed a line. I want to keep our relationship professional, and I think it's important that we clarify that now." For a moment, silence hung in the air, the weight of her words settling between them. Stephen's expression darkened, his gaze narrowing as he regarded her with a look that was equal parts surprise and displeasure. "Ruth," he began slowly, his voice edged with tension, "I don't think you understand the nature of our arrangement." She felt her pulse quicken, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "I do understand, Stephen. I can't continue like this. I'm here to work, to succeed based on my skills and dedication, not because of anything else." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling as he studied her. "You realize, of course, that this promotion was more than just a reward for hard work, Ruth. Loyalty is a rare quality, and I rewarded you because I believed you were committed to me." Her heart sank at his words, the realization settling in that this promotion had never been about her dedication or skill alone. It had been about power, control, and an arrangement that had little to do with her actual abilities. But even as disappointment washed over her, she felt a renewed sense of strength. "I understand that now," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But I'm willing to work hard to prove my worth on my own terms." Stephen's jaw tightened, and he regarded her with a look of cold resolve. "That's unfortunate, Ruth. I thought we had an understanding." The words hung in the air like a threat, and Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. But she held her ground, refusing to back down. She knew that whatever happened next, she was finally taking control of her life. After the confrontation, Ruth's days at the office took on a new and uneasy rhythm. She could feel the shift in Stephen's demeanor toward her. He became colder, more distant, and the tasks he assigned her grew increasingly tedious and unimportant. It was as if he was testing her resolve, waiting for her to come crawling back, willing to accept whatever terms he dictated. Colleagues who had once looked up to her now watched her with wary eyes, clearly picking up on the tension between her and Stephen. The whispers grew louder, and Ruth felt the isolation deepen with each passing day. But she knew she had made the right choice, even if it cost her everything. One afternoon, her close friend and colleague, Amy, approached her quietly in the break room. "Ruth, are you all right?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. Ruth managed a faint smile, grateful for the small show of support. "I'm managing," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. Amy hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard about what happened with Stephen. You don't have to go through this alone, you know. I'm here if you need anything." The kindness in Amy's words brought a rush of relief to Ruth's heart. For so long, she had felt alone in her struggle, but now, with someone by her side, she felt a renewed sense of courage. As the weeks went on, Ruth continued to work, determined to prove herself without relying on Stephen's favor. She threw herself into her assignments, focusing on the work itself and reminding herself why she had pursued this career in the first place. With each task she completed, she felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond the approval of her boss or the allure of a title. This was about her, her integrity, and her commitment to her own values. One evening, as she was gathering her things to leave, Stephen approached her desk. His expression was unreadable, his tone devoid of the warmth he had once used to draw her in. "Ruth, a word?" She straightened, meeting his gaze with a calm resolve. "Of course." They stepped into his office, the familiar space now feeling like a battleground where she had fought to reclaim her self-worth. Stephen closed the door, crossing his arms as he looked at her with a cool detachment. "I've been reviewing your performance," he said, his tone calculated. "It seems you're not meeting the standards I had expected." Ruth's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. "I'm doing my job to the best of my ability, Stephen. I know that my performance speaks for itself." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of irritation flickering in his eyes. "Is that so?" "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "And if my work isn't up to your expectations, then I would appreciate direct feedback. I'm here to improve, not to play games." Stephen's expression hardened, and she sensed that he was testing her, pushing her to see if she would break. But Ruth held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. After a long, tense silence, Stephen finally nodded, though his expression remained distant. "Very well, Ruth. Just remember, loyalty goes both ways." As she left his office, she felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. She knew her future at the company was uncertain, that Stephen might very well find a way to make her life difficult. But she also knew that she had reclaimed her power, her sense of self, and nothing he could do would take that away from her. In the weeks that followed, Ruth began to explore new opportunities, reaching out to former colleagues and networking in search of a workplace where her skills would be valued for what they truly were. She had learned a hard lesson, one that had cost her deeply, but she was ready to move forward, stronger and wiser than before. One afternoon, she received a call from a small, rising firm that had heard of her work and was eager to bring someone with her expertise onto their team. It was a step down in title, perhaps, but the role offered something she valued even more: a fresh start, one free of compromise and moral ambiguity. As she accepted the offer, Ruth felt a sense of liberation she hadn't felt in years. She was ready to rebuild her career, but this time on her own terms. She had faced the darkest side of her ambition, wrestled with the cost of compromise, and emerged with her integrity intact. The experience with Stephen had left scars, but it had also given her a new sense of resilience, a determination to honor her values no matter what. And as she walked out of the building for the last time, Ruth smiled, finally free to pursue a future she could be proud of.